I mean, these are the complicated questions, aren't they? That when we go, oh, predator-free New Zealand, what do we define as a predator? Not Curie, not mice, apparently.
Wouldn't you be more concerned about Norway rats, though?
Well, I don't know. You know, I mean, I suspect I wouldn't be able to tell the difference, would I?
Oh, well, you'd probably get quite good at it, I think.
Do you think?
They're lovely little animals, Curie.
Yeah. I was interested in your suggestion, James, that there were so many disagreements about the importance of conservation in New Zealand, not necessarily predator-free New Zealand, but the importance of conservation in New Zealand. These are one of the issues that you have to deal with on your panel. What are the strongest disagreements?
I think it's just prioritization. So I think that there are plenty of people. We're speaking to people here who care deeply. You're here, you've turned up, hundreds of you, fantastic. But you all know people who have no particular interest in wildlife, who don't have a connection with it, they don't have some recreational connection, they're not fishers, they're whatever. So we have to think about opportunity costs. So if we're spending a lot of time and effort doing these big, difficult things, there's other things we could be doing with that money, and those things might be stopping people sleeping in cars. So they might be education and health and all those things.
So that's people just not caring about it. There are people who are actively against it, are there, do you think?
There are people who are certainly actively against certain ways of undertaking conservation. Absolutely, there are people who hate 1080 and want to throw ferrets over the fences of eco-sanctuaries and things like this. That's not a huge number of people.
Seriously.
Don't tell your friends, but there are people.
I mean, as Edie was saying, there are people who believe in the sanctity of life, but I bet they kill flies, and I bet they trap mice. Or maybe not. What do you think?
People are quite complex, and like we talked about, they're irrational. So they might say that they believe in the sanctity of all life, but a spider walks in, they whack it. That's people, and that's why we have psychologists, because it's not surprising. Psychologists aren't surprised by this, but when you talk to biologists and ecologists, they're like, oh, you mean we don't tell them if A, then B, and then C? No, humans don't work that way. So we need to recognize people have a lot of values. Never try and correct their irrational thinking. That never works. It just creates greater polarization. Instead, look for consensus building and say, I'm listening to you, I'm hearing you. So bring everybody with their diverse set of opinions to a table.
That's so annoying, isn't it? I hear what you're saying, and now I'm going to do something completely different, or what I was going to do in the first place anyway.
No.
But I have heard you.
That's patsy consultation, and people see through that. But real, honest, working together with a blank slate and moving things forward is what we want as a society. Nobody really enjoys top-down initiatives. Sometimes they have to happen. But we work better as a society when we all come and work together and talk about different pros and cons.
I think we've also got to be careful of thinking that what you either value something or you don't.
It's a spectrum.
It's a spectrum. Value is almost always on a spectrum. So when people say they value the sanctity of life, they don't value it over everything. So what we're talking about are things that people would prioritize in certain ways, and people have different priorities. And so, it's easy to say there are people who don't like conservation, there are people who care about other things more. That's not irrational. They're caring about things that you and I care about too.
Also, I suppose it depends on what people think is nature. Nature might be being able to go and shoot deer.
Yep.
Whereas nature to somebody else is having no deer to shoot because deer are a pest.
Nature to lots of New Zealanders is landscape, rather more than a species in it.
Curated landscape, you mean?
No, not necessarily. It could be just beach forest, but people often think of mountains and the kind of the big purview rather than thinking of particular organisms or particular ecosystems. That's what you guys think of.
Yeah, and its ecosystem, I suppose, that predator-free New Zealand needs to emphasise, right? It's not, you're not killing possums for the sake of it. You're killing possums so that the forest can thrive. That's a more complicated idea.
Yep. Ecosystem health or something like this is an idea that we've talked about a bit on the panel. It's very difficult to be precise about, but wanting to enhance ecosystem function is part of the goal of PFNT.
But are there any, again, unintended consequences to do with ecosystem health and predator-free New Zealand? Could we be undermining some areas of the ecosystem by pursuing predator-free? Anybody know the answer to that?
Possibly. There's probably more immediate things like, use of toxins. I mean, those are the first immediate things you come into account. If you're using things like anticoagulants that are going to persistently build up in the environment, such as those that are spread constantly around the Greater Wellington region for controlling rodents. Be slightly political. Those sorts of things are, I guess, the things that immediately come into your attention. And of course, when people are concerned about those.
Right.
Yeah.
And do you think that it's necessary to find an alternative to those in order to get a consensus?
I think it depends on the people and the place. I think there's just a range of trade-offs. And what everybody would like is to have some agent that you can use to get rid of things that everybody agrees that you want to get rid of them, and that agent is non-toxic and is extremely inexpensive, and therefore doesn't divert the taxpayers' money from things. But it doesn't really quite work that way.
See, the whole project is already watered down by the exclusion of the list of predators of feral cats, for example, right?
Is it watered down, or is it already, you just talked about the values, just a lot of discussion of values that people place on different species, the value that people put on recreation, such as hunting, fishing.
Yeah.
And so there's another value on what people put on their, I was going to say pets, but I found out today that was an offensive word to some people. Companion animals, yes, okay. So there are all these different things, and if you actually look at the range of species that's targeted in predator-free New Zealand, you can see that all of those things have already been built in. Why aren't cats on the list? Why aren't deer on the list? Why aren't pigs on the list?
Because a lot of people find them necessary.
Why aren't trout on the list?
Yeah, well, exactly.
And because people like to go out and shoot deer and hunt trout, and they like to have their pussycat.
So one would have thought that the 7 species that you've got on your list would be completely non-contentious because you boiled off the others. You boiled off your cats and you deer and you
so to speak.
So to speak. But still, you've got the issue of curie. You've got the issue of presumably people wanting to track possums for the fur. If there are no possums, they won't be able to do that.
There are certainly other things that could be on the list that would be uncontentious. German wasps would be uncontentious as something that people want to get rid of.
Well, why didn't those go on the list then?
Didn't design the list. Anybody?
I think though the issue, Kim, is that whether you want to take animals off the list or add another species, what we do know is that with the animals that are on the list, that it will make a very big difference to biodiversity and the recovery of biodiversity. Yep. So if the consensus is around the fact that we want biodiversity to, health to improve, then it's a good start. If everyone would like German wasps to be added to the list, that's up for discussion. But is it an ethical position to sit and do nothing while we decide whether or not we should have 7 species or 8?
It's also a political decision. So if Kennedy had said, we're going to put somebody on Mars, not because, but because it's hard. Well, it would have been hard, wouldn't it? It would have been even harder, but no political will. You couldn't have done it. The money, too expensive. So if you're going to do a moonshot, it's a difficult thing to do. You've got to make a judgment about what you can do, what people will support, what you might be able to build institutions to support, and so you've got to stop somewhere. So this is where we've stopped.
And just because the animal's not on the list doesn't mean there aren't programs and projects to deal with it. German wasps, the Department of Conservation in partnership has an extensive program to work with controlling their numbers. So just because they're not on the list doesn't mean things aren't happening to deal with those situations. feral cats.
And feral cats are being handled?
There's different, there was a whole session today that discussed cats, and Mafanwe did a great explanation of what's happening here in Wellington to try and tackle those issues about cats on the whole spectrum, from companion to feral and stray.
There's a lot to worry about, really, isn't there?